All right. Everyone, live from El Salvador, welcome to today's Sovereignty. Thank you very much for joining us on May the 4th. It's the birthday of Bitcoin legend Hal Finney. My name is Magnus, and today we're joined by Edan Yago and Robert Breedlove. Ladies and gentlemen, don't forget that Twitter Spaces are interactive, so we'll be taking questions at the end, so we will get to you at the end. So our in-house guest is Edan Yago. He's a Bitcoin and OG and early contributor to the Sovryn protocol. Yago's been in the space since 2011 and has founded multiple Bitcoin-focused companies. He believes that Sovryn plays a crucial part in creating a world built on Bitcoin. How you doing, Yago? Welcome.
Hello, hello.
Hello. And we also have Robert Breedlove. He's a freedom maximalist, ex-hedge fund manager, and philosopher in the Bitcoin space. He's known for hosting the What is Money podcast and being the founder and CEO of Parallax Digital. Welcome, Robert.
Hey. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great. And guys, it's time for some Bitcoin jokes with Magnus as an icebreaker and lighten the mood. We'll start off with this one. Why do crypto investors always want a Lambo? Because Maserati belongs to Fiat. Oh yeah. I got one more for you, folks. This Bitcoin crash was way worse than a divorce. I lost half my portfolio, and I still have my wife. Thank you. Thank you very much. All right, we'll get right into it. So let's start off some updates, guys. Robert and Yago, could you tell us about the projects that you're working on? What's exciting you at the moment?
So I'm spending most of my time on Sovryn, and there's a lot going on in Sovryn that I find very exciting. I think potentially most relevant to the conversation I think we're going to have today is the construction of those tools and institutions that we need in order to provide people with sovereignty in a post-nationalist, post-nation-state world. And so what recently we've been seeing in Sovryn is the more and more emergence of community-driven initiatives to build out institutional capacity. I recently was able to publish about the work that sovereigns have been doing in Ukraine, where we'd been involved in effectively setting up covert operations in order to help members of the sovereign community get out of danger and set up what is being called the B team, which is sort of like the covert operations team for Bitcoin to try and help sovereign community members and more broadly the Bitcoin community today and in the future in situations of uncertainty and danger where nation states aren't able to step in or won't step in.
Hey guys, what am I excited about right now? I'm actually in the process of converting the series that we launched the show with, which was the Sailor series. We're converting that into a couple of things. One is a course on Sailor Academy, which you guys may know is Mr. Sailor's free university-level educational system. It's online now, but I think it's actually in the process of becoming an actual university as well. I think that'll be cool. The series has been very impactful on a lot of people. The reach of it has been quite significant. So I think converting all of those useful lessons and that knowledge into something more formal is something to be excited about. Hopefully it helps reach and orange pill more people. We're also converting the Sailor series into an ebook. That's very early right now. We already have transcribed the entire thing, but now we're actually going to convert it into a full-fledged ebook. And then we'll donate all the proceeds from the sales of that ebook to the Sailor Academy as well. So just two exciting projects on the educational front. Other than that, I'm really focused on the What is Money show. We just released our episode with Jordan Peterson that was recorded in Miami 2 days ago. That one is flying high, getting really good feedback on that. And I aim to do a lot of other, both live episodes and long-form series with several other big thinkers that you probably recognize. And aside from that, I'm spending most of my time reading and writing, publishing a lot of the writing on my Substack, which is in Freedom Analects, and working towards compiling all of this written work into a book at some point. Actually, it's not going to be just a straight compilation. I'm just trying to work out my thinking on these various topics that I'll hope to synthesize into an original work that will be published as a book, hopefully by the end of the year. But writing is notoriously difficult and always takes longer than you expect, so don't hold me to that.
Excellent. Yeah, I'll be checking out that Peterson podcast for sure. I wanted to start off also with you guys. I understand both of you were influenced by the Sovryn Individual book from 1997. And, sovereignty is a central theme in most of both of your works. Robert and Yago, what were your main takeaways that inspired you from this novel, all the way back in 97? You'd like to go first, Yago, maybe?
Well, I didn't come across that book in 97. I came across it much later. Actually, after I discovered Bitcoin. But I think by that time, somehow, the book was particularly cool because it summarized for me a lot of things that I was already thinking about. And I think one of the reasons that maybe I was already thinking in that direction was there were two or three books, I think, which had already sent me thinking in that direction. One was the books by Ayn Rand, which I sort of encountered when I was a teenager, and then obviously Galt's Gulch was a story which resonated. Then in the mid-90s, I came across a book by a British philosopher by the name of Ian Angel, who wrote a book called The New Barbarian Manifesto, which is in some ways very similar to the Sovryn Individual, but less well known, and has a similar thesis. And then some years later, I also managed to come across a book called The Machinery of Freedom by David Friedman, the son of Milton Friedman. I actually first came across Milton Friedman's Free to Choose, but David takes Milton's ideas much, much further. And so I kind of somehow managed to miss the Sovryn Individual, but when I read it, I felt it was the best summary of all the various ideas and sort of had the most predictive power of these various books. And a big part of why Sovryn is called Sovryn is because most of the people who were working on it early on were influenced by the book The Sovryn Individual and wanted to build out a project which would help sort of create the tools that we need for a world of sovereigns.
Can you hear me? Okay, sorry. Couldn't turn the mic off.
Oh, there you go.
Sorry, I have trouble with turning the mic on there. Yeah, like Yago, I did not discover the Sovryn Individual until after I got into Bitcoin as well. I think I read the book originally in 2017 or 18. And I guess the major light bulb for me was I had read a lot about economics up until that point. I had recently been going down the Austrian economic rabbit hole for probably 12 to 24 months before reading that. I was just reading everything I could get my hands on. And prior to that, I had more of like a Keynesian economic knowledge base. And prior to that, I had been down the central banking rabbit hole with books like The Creature from Jekyll Island and whatnot. So I had this kind of basis for financial, economic knowledge, but the epiphany that the Sovryn Individual gave me was this whole concept of the logic of violence, or what you could also call the economics of coercion or violence, and how that has shaped human self-organization across history. It's kind of hidden in plain sight in a way. Once you once you get into that book, you're like, oh my God, I can't believe I never thought of this before. But and there's a lot of rabbit holes the book goes down. But I would say, to try to sum up the thesis in something that's relatively simplistic, is essentially the lower the cost of defense, right? The easier or cheaper it is to defend property or person, the more decentralized our socioeconomic organizations tend to be. And that's a big idea, but again, it's somewhat intuitive. Like, if the cost of defense is really low, we don't need as much reliance on a central monopoly on violence to amortize that cost across a large structure, right? You could just, encryption being the obvious one that the book goes into, it makes the cost of defending information or capital in a post-Bitcoin world extremely cheap. It makes the cost of defending your property orders of magnitude cheaper than we've ever had before. And so the book gives various examples of the kind of the cost of defense and how it's increased and decreased from technological innovation to innovation, and how that's affected how we've structured ourselves. And it basically just extrapolates that thesis forward and says, okay, well, by virtue of encryption, we're going to have digital money, which is, translatable into digital property at some point. Obviously, that's still a chasm we've yet to cross as a civilization. But in that world where property and money is digitized and protected via encryption, the cost of defending it is orders of magnitude lower than anything we've ever seen. And so the thesis of that book is that the commensurate decentralization will be orders of magnitude greater than we've ever seen, and hence the title, The Sovryn Individual, versus, sovereign nations as we tend to think of them today. That was my big kind of light bulb moment with that book. And then what's funny, the book is amazing, but if you get into the bibliography, it gets even better. Right? There's a long literature on this. Many people have written about the economics of violence and how it influences human self-organization. So I've been writing about this in the Sovereignism essay series, just wrestling with different ideas that came up both in my reading of that book and its bibliography and other conversations I was having about it at the time. So it goes down a lot of rabbit holes. I think we've published 9 of 12 at this point, and each essay, they're pretty long. They're 4,000 to 8,000 words each. Each one probably goes into 3 to 4 topics related to this whole thesis. So there's a lot. There's a lot to learn there, and it's I think the most exciting way to look at the implications of Bitcoin on the world is through the lens of that book's thesis and related books on the economics of violence.
Yes, I think it's great. A great place to start is the calculus of violence. I think it's actually broader than the calculus of violence. It's the calculus of power, because power constructs our world, right? Those who are powerful, those groups to which power accrues will have more influence, and that influences the structure of our world. And you can use this as a predictive tool. But the calculus of violence is the most important aspect of this, because violence is the base of power. So it's sort of like the buck stops here. The ultimate power is the power of violence. It has the greatest power of coercion. And there's really interesting examples to help think about how this has shaped different societies over the course of human history. So we can think about the magical 100 years of Athens, where democracy and philosophy and physics and so much of our culture was invented. It was like one of the richest times. It was a time where, for the first time, defense was very powerful, but it required a high degree of social cohesion and discipline because of the structure of the phalanx, and required the participation of effectively all of society, and for everyone to be wealthy enough and to be politically engaged enough to want to participate in a phalanx. And so that created a very magical moment in time, because of the structure of power that came with the phalanx. Later, if you look at the feudal period, once again, feudal period was a period where defense had particular power. Castles and moats and citadels were almost unassailable. And so this led to power devolving to very, very localized areas. Basically, power devolved to wherever the nearest castle was. However, this time, it wasn't dependent on a small number, the participation of everyone, because power came from an expensive structure, the castle, and ironclad men and horses, which was extremely expensive, and so it created the elite and nobility, and so that shaped the structure of all of Europe for 1,000 years. And so, if you look at, you take this further, you look at gunpowder. Gunpowder made feudalism impossible, because it once again changed the logic of violence in two ways. You now needed large numbers of people because guns were very, very cheap, easy to use, and so you could scale armies very, very well, and you needed to because the initial guns were very, very slow to fire. And at the same time, offense became much more powerful. Until trench warfare in World War One, there was almost no advantage to defensive posture. And so you had, Napoleon. You had the creation of nationalism in Prussia in order to defend against, the potential threats of massed armies. You need to have a massed army of yourself. And so the government started indoctrinating people with public education and creating a social a welfare system in order to have a bargaining chip with which to bring people into national armies. And so the entire narrative of history is these massive structural changes based on the structural change of the calculus of violence and power. And what you can do is you can extrapolate from this further. And so if you look at Bitcoin, what it does is it creates the most powerful defense in terms of defensive asymmetry that's ever existed, right? So any individual can have the ability to control Bitcoin in a way which is defensible even against the greatest nation state. It encourages anonymity. It reduces the value of borders, enhances the value of digital activity. And so you start thinking about the world and what it will look like given those and a few other changes, and the shape of tomorrow starts to take shape.
Yeah, a lot of great points there. Maybe one nuance or wrinkle I would add is, I plan on writing about this. I haven't got around to it yet. Peterson talks a lot about power and how it's the postmodern perspective that all human relations are premised on power dynamics, essentially. And he disagrees with that. But I think where the point of confusion lies, I think, in the word power itself, that we actually have to break that. We have to decompose that into at least two types of power. There may be more. I haven't completely crystallized my thoughts on this, but there is at least physical power, or power in the pure physics definition of the term. And then there's the, I think, more often understood term, which is political power itself. And physical power, again, if we just look at the actual physics formulaic definition for power, it's the capacity to do work over time. And the physics definition for work, one level deeper, is basically force projected across distance to create displacement, physical displacement across distance. So power in the physics sense becomes force across space and time, effectively. You're actually projecting energy across space and time, essentially. Political power, on the other hand, tends to be, I think, understood as one's capacity to control or influence the social apparatus of coercion, compulsion, violence, which is government, right? That's essentially what government is. That's what the rule of law is. All of this grounds out in property, by the way, like the rights an individual has to their stuff, right, to the value that they create in the world. That's really what that layer is meant to create, this political layer. And so if someone is inside of the hierarchy of government, then they have some influence on its workings, right? They can use it to impose power, right, in a way that you can basically influence the shape of the world or outcomes by using these levers that control the apparatus of coercion, compulsion, violence. So although they're related, I do think they're different. We could say the sun is extremely powerful, right? The sun's projecting a lot of energy across space and time, but obviously it's apolitical in the truest sense. No matter what we do here on Earth, the sun does not give a shit. It's just going to keep doing its thing. But so they're clearly different, but they're also related. And the example I like to draw on here is if you could somehow send a guy, more likely some guys, with, say, a few Uzis and sufficient ammunition back into the 15th century, it wouldn't be long before those guys were at the top of the political power hierarchy, right? By virtue of their ability to project force across space and time in a way that no one else living in the technological realities of the 15th century could or could stand against, right? There'd be no defense effectively against that. So in many ways, the civilization that figures out how to project physical power most efficiently or at the greatest magnitude tends to rise in the political power hierarchy. And to tie that to Yago's point, we got castles were this very expensive cost of defense. So as a result, we had a very centralized society, right? Power tended to centralize into the hands of those that could afford it because castles are fucking expensive. A war horse is expensive. A suit of armor is very expensive. These things were not accessible to the layman. But then, as the authors of Sovryn Individual wrote about, before the Sovryn Individual actually, they wrote about the gunpowder revolution and how that completely flipped social structure on its head, because all of a sudden a single peasant with a rifle and gunpowder could take out an armed knight on horseback at 100 yards, whereas before gunpowder 40 peasants couldn't stand a chance against one armed knight. So the whole dynamics of physical power projection changed as a result of a technological innovation that then reshaped all of the political organization in the world. And Bitcoin is radical because it effectively takes the cost of defense to near zero. Right? If you've got your Bitcoin custodied in a geographically distributed multi-sig and all of your protocols are sound and you maintain them over time, there's very little cost to that, and you can really store as much wealth as you want via that method. You could store billions. So it's when you really start to understand that string of ideas, I think that it just blows your mind as to what the world could look like post-Bitcoin. In this world where property becomes somewhat inviolable or nearly inviolable, that the role and relevance of governments, national borders, our identification with politics and political identity at both the individual and the group level, all of these things fall away. They just go away.
Robert, I'm curious how you imagine this world post nation state highly influenced by the Bitcoin innovation. What do you think it looks like, or sort of what are some of the threads that you would put on?
Well, I think it's first I should say I have no idea. Clearly, it's that significant of an innovation. But I try to just look at the economics, and again, you would presume it would be a more decentralized world. I think we get to something that's more like maybe digital tribalism, something like that, where we have 200 some odd nation states today. Maybe nation states decompose into free private cities, perhaps on the order of maybe 20,000 worldwide. The other interesting thing to think about here is how actually Bitcoin mining shapes how we distribute ourselves across the planet, because now all of a sudden any untapped energy source in the world, you can build a community of Bitcoin mining around that. So how many untapped, hydroelectric sources, geothermal, tidal, anything you can think of, how many of those exists across the face of the earth? I have no idea. But it does open up the possibility of communities organizing themselves around those energy sources to be effectively self-sovereign, communities centered on Bitcoin mining. So between that, the radical decrease in the cost of protecting or defending property also tends to make you think that we'd have much more decentralized organizational structure. I think we end up like something like that. You just see government becoming kind of a free market enterprise. Maybe you opt into, maybe everyone holds Bitcoin as their primary property, right? It's the one thing you can own independent of any monopoly on violence, and perhaps you stake some of that Bitcoin with a free private city for citizenship services. And then maybe there's agreements of reciprocity between certain free private cities across the world that, if you subscribe to one, you get access to 10, kind of like a Soho house or something for government. So I don't know. It's all very hypothetical in my mind, but it's definitely fun to think about.
I think we do see some hints already. So I think you could look at the crypto space as sort of a LARP of what it might look like in many ways. So one is it's a far more international world, right? So people are collaborating in communities without any reference to geographical affiliation. Their affiliation tends to be economic or cultural. And I think so. That's I think one very, very, like if I had to point to one, the biggest change that I expect we'll see is that we will see the decomposition of borders. Borders are not going to make sense anymore. And when you take away borders, you take away the geographical monopoly of government, which means that you take away the idea of passports, which means you take away the concept of visa and immigration, which means that you take away the concept of different rules for different geographies. Like our entire the entire nation-state world, and we've come to accept this as sort of like this is the way things are, but it's a pretty new innovation. It's maybe 250 years we have had a world where geography has played a role in this way. Used to be that people could basically go wherever they wanted. Most people didn't, obviously. Travel was hard. But, passports were invented in World War One. It's a very, very new concept. So I think that's one of the first things that we see. I think we are likely to see a higher degree of cultural divergence. Right now we're seeing it in sort of like this tribalism. But as people are able to collect, we saw sort of with subreddits and with the early internet, people were able to collect around ideas and sort of create their own little subcultures and create little corners of weirdness on the internet. But when that can be tied to the rest of your life, and particularly tied to your economic life, and tied to potentially your political life, I think the level of weirdness and the degree to which people take weirdness seriously is going to increase. And so up until now, the arrow of globalization has been the arrow of homogeneity. So the entire world is becoming and has been becoming more and more similar. Everything looks like a Starbucks. I think the arrow of globalization isn't changing direction, but it will increasingly lead not to a world of greater homogeneity, but to a world which is increasingly incomprehensible, to and exotic, which is going to cause a weird kind of divergence from where we are now. And then the third thing, and I think for me this is the part that I'm most concentrated on, is I think we need to rethink how we're going to supply a whole bunch of services that today are monopolized and provided only by government, or almost entirely dependent on government. And that's everything from basic R&D and science to security provision, especially like major security, like not just criminal security, but how do you protect yourself against a Russia or a China, to education, to charity. These were all things that until the invention of the nation state were held as the roles primarily of civil society, maybe with the exception of defense, right? So if you look at the average OECD country today, about 45% of its GDP is spent by the government. At the height of World War I, the British government was spending 12% of its entire GDP. So, prior to the 20th century, governments typically represented between 3 and 10% of GDP in their entirety. So that's going to be another major shift. And I think that the kind of structures that we come up with are entirely dependent on us. And so with this last part, what kind of civil society are we going to create? What kind of institutions are we going to create? It's less a question of trying to predict and more a question of trying to create. And I think that this is, when I think of hyper-Bitcoinization in its widest sense, for me, hyper-Bitcoinization is about trying to create a world of institutions where Bitcoin is not the only decentralized institution, it's just the first decentralized institution. It's the basic institution of money. But now we have to think about how do we create dispute resolution? How do we create deal with things like health and safety, like travel? These are like identity. These are very, very significant challenges which Web3 supposedly tackles, but I don't think has been taken seriously.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you on most of that. I guess another thing that would be smart to touch on, there's this, all of the costs of government are largely imputed into business operations today. So, the cost of compliance, cost of inflation, taxation, all of these contingencies that businesses have to deal with, these are effectively fixed costs on the business. Like just to open your doors and exist as an entity, you incur these fixed costs that you then attempt to offset with the scale of operations. So there's this correlation between the preponderance of fixed costs for your average organization and economies of scale, basically, right? They benefit. It pays to be bigger in that world because you have larger fixed costs to offset or amortize across your size of operation, your scale of operation. So in this world where all of a sudden, people have the option of Bitcoin only, as I think there's a line in the Sovryn Individual that only the most patriotic or stupid will hold their wealth in a fiat currency when something like Bitcoin is an option, because it's tax inflation-free money. Effectively, it's the rational decision to make. When people have that option to move wealth into this non-state medium of value storage and transfer, then all of a sudden that forces governments to start dealing with people a lot more honestly. They actually have to create value for customers, which is not something you have to deal with in a monopolist situation. If I'm a monopolist, I have zero incentive to be accountable whatsoever to you or your preferences as a citizen. So Bitcoin kind of re-engages that effect that gold sort of approximated historically. Historically, if you were being mistreated, you had to, put all your wealth into gold and then ship it elsewhere and move your life. Bitcoin just makes that whole process a lot more straightforward and a lot cheaper. So in this world where then the fixed costs of regulation, taxation, all of these things start to collapse, you would expect the economies of scale associated with business to collapse as well. So the name of the game in the world today is to try and build a business that is, independent of all this crypto stuff. If you just were building a traditional business today, you want to get too big to fail or die trying, effectively. You want to get public listing. You want to be so big that the government has to protect you, that you're systemically important, whatever. That whole notion goes away in a Bitcoin world. So I think with that, so we have decentralized government, lower economies of scale, or say less relevance to economies of scale for most organizations. I think the world moves away from this kind of China-centered mass production model to something more like mass customization, where you have, clearly other things play into this, like 3D printing and just information technology in general, but you move to this world where the uniqueness of customer demand starts to be reflected into the value chain rather than just what's the biggest producer that can make the cheapest widgets possible, as we have with the kind of, like I said, China mass production model today. And so with this, you might see things like the resurgence of artisan craftsmanship, like instead of just getting this one-size-fits-all widget for everything, there's probably going to be a lot more complexity, a lot more nuance in product and service offerings across all domains of business. And, I guess to make it maybe just super simple, it's like government exists to preserve property. That's its sole purpose. That's the purpose of its existence as a business entity, is to preserve property. When we now have recourse to something that's non-governmental that can preserve at least monetary property, which is clearly it's not physical property in the real world, but it is property with money, that puts a big check on the overgrowth of government via fiat. And so it seems somewhat obvious to me that demand for property protection services from traditional government is just going to collapse. And now that property can be defended more cheaply via encryption and Bitcoin. So it really is, and this is why I think we can all talk about it for just hundreds and thousands of hours without ever figuring it all out. The significance of this change is hard to overstate, and it's even more difficult to understand exactly what the world looks like deeper into this Bitcoinized future.
So, Robert, I think maybe this is a good opportunity. So, we've spoken about how Bitcoin changes things, but Bitcoin isn't the only thing happening. Bitcoin creates massive defensive power for the individual and for small groups. for tribes that are non-geographically based and for pseudonymous people and groups. But there are two very important other powers that are highly centralizing and have very, very powerful offensive capability. The first is pervasive surveillance, which provides massive power to centralized entities and makes individuals extremely vulnerable. The second is artificial intelligence, which requires huge amounts of computing power available only to centralized server owners, and potentially creates a whole new type of asymmetry. And especially if you combine those two and sort of use machine learning to be willing to identify potential threats to centralized power even before they arise. The poster child for this is China. But countries around the world are trying to learn from and are learning from China. And, lockdowns was just one way in which the West aped into whatever it is that China was doing. CBDCs is another example. And so my sense is that Bitcoin in and of itself is not enough. That Bitcoin has provided us with a way to come together, to form power, to have a very strong base of defense. But if we aren't able to create the kind of civil society structures and the sort of alliances of collective defense against these very powerful, forces of surveillance, then we remain at risk.
Would you mind expanding on exactly which types of surveillance you're referring to?
Yes, certainly. So I think it's surveillance of all kinds. But what we see, I think China is a great example. So in China, effectively all communication is surveilled. They're surveilled both algorithmically and with large numbers of people who are providing surveillance. And this means that not only are they able to censor certain types of information quite effectively, but they're also able to identify dissent very early on. They're able to identify networks, social networks that may be related to dissent, and they're also able to punish collectively. Some of these things they're already started to do with gusto, and some of these things seem to be developing over time. Now, of course, when it comes to surveilling communications, encryption provides a potential outlet. However, encryption is only as good as the devices that you're using. The creators devices are extremely centralized, and there are other forms of surveillance as well. So it's not entirely clear always what it is that you should be concerned about. So surveillance includes things not just what you write, but also what kind of content you consume. It includes information about who it is that you are interacting with, meta information about where you've been, what type of content you're sharing or consuming, tracking your location. So, the more we become imbued in this digital world, the more transparent we become.
Yeah, I hear you on that. I guess I don't, so with China, just to tell you where I'm coming from first, I grew up in Tennessee, which is the American South. Culturally, there is a great deal of independence in the South. There was a civil war fought a long time ago. People tend to be quite outspoken, quite skeptical of government. Guns are more or less ubiquitous in the South. I shouldn't. I'm not speaking on behalf of everyone, but just the social circles that I run in. And I think that the difference there with somewhere like China, where I have never been, this is just a place I've read about, done limited reading about, but my understanding is that there's been this process of intergenerational conditioning in China, where they've just conditioned the population to the inevitability or ubiquity of government power, right? There's this old discussion about being a trade-off between freedom and security. You know, you can, in theory, you can have a super invasive top-down government where you have no freedom, but you could have significant amounts of security. And the place that comes to mind here is the empire of Genghis Khan, where they said a naked virgin could ride horseback across the country with a pot of gold around her neck, and she would be untouched. You know, extreme security. Nobody did anything inside of his empire except him, right? It was very, very brutal, dictatorial structure. So it seems to me like a place like China has been groomed for this digital dystopian 1984 top-down governance ad infinitum model. And I think culturally there are other places in the world that are more resistant to that. And that's where I think the battle lines ultimately have to be drawn, is the tech is going to emerge, right, that supports this aim of government control. There will also be countermeasures and other forms of tech in this sort of cat and mouse race between governments trying to centralize and independent actors looking to have freedom and decentralize. But it really will come down to this cultural divide of where are communities strong? Where are people putting something above government? And this is where I think things like Christianity in the South, in South America, and other parts of the world, those places with deep religious tradition or wisdom tradition have tended to be more resilient against ideological attacks of the state. You know, so like, for instance, in New York City and in Los Angeles in the U.S., these are both very liberal, non-Christian, atheistic cultures. They have been significantly impacted by the mask psychosis and the vaccine mandates and all of this, where they've basically fallen in line. And the way Balaji put this once was that in those parts of the world where they don't have a deeper wisdom tradition, they tend to put GOV above GOD. So my point here would be that culturally, I am seeking to establish myself in parts of the world that are inherently non-compliant and skeptical of government action, and that put GOD above GOV, as it should be, in my estimation. In places where there's a premium placed on community, on whether that's through church or some other means, a premium placed on the nuclear family, a premium placed on individual sovereignty, independence, gun ownership, free speech. All of these things matter a lot, because you basically, again, if we're just talking about it from an economics lens, those types of cultures are much more expensive to tyrannize than it is a well-groomed, intergenerationally groomed culture like China, where they've just come to, and again, a limited understanding about this. My understanding is they have just taken the bait, right? We have a very secure working model for society in China, so long as you follow the rules, right? If you don't follow the rules, well, then you're being publicly shamed on a billboard, or your CBDC is being turned off, or you've lost access to travel, or whatever the sanction tends to be. It's anti-liberty, anti-freedom. So,
well, I'll just I'd point as a counter argument to that. You look at Macau, Hong Kong, Taiwan. These are all China. And absent the communist government of Mao, they created entirely different political structures. So the same thing works in reverse, right? And I think this brings us back to where
Hong Kong in particular, though, is not China. I mean, I know it is.
I
now
mean,
technically.
what I mean is that the population in Macau, the population, you're talking about culture, but we're talking about the same
I'm
people.
talking
We're
about culture. Yeah.
the same people separated by circumstance, right? And I think this comes back to where we started the conversation, which is that ultimately it's the calculus of violence, the calculus of power that dictates the type of culture, the type of politics that you end up with. And that's why I think we're at a particularly dangerous and optimistic. We're like at we're at the moment in history where we decide sort of where things go forward, because we have encryption and we have Bitcoin and we have the internet. These are very powerful decentralizing forces that empower sovereign individuals. But we also have AI server farms and mass surveillance, which empower centralized forces and tyranny. And it's not clear. You know, we're between heaven and hell right now.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. And the way I've put it is that it seems like the spectrum of possibility in the digital age has just been blown wide open. Right? We could go towards a digital, I hate the word utopia, but something that's much more freedom-centric if Bitcoin is to succeed and kind of sweep across the earth into this sovereign individual style model of human organization, or equally, it seems possible this dystopian 1984 top-down AI surveillance machine is on the table as well. So again, where I agree with you on that, where I then look to is culture itself, because I think culture is the ultimate immune system against tyranny. Wherever it's already embedded in people to be skeptical of government, they're well armed, they speak their mind, their parents have done it, their grandparents did it. Like, that's the place you want to be. You want to be in a place where you're just a pain in the ass. If they're going to tyrannize you, it's going to be really hard. It's going to take such a great deal of expenditure and headache and potentially warfare to tyrannize somewhere like the American South versus mainland China. And on the points of, I don't know a lot about Macau, but I know some about the history of Hong Kong. They have a deep tradition and history of liberalism there. I mean, that's why Hong Kong was an economic miracle originally, is they had people in power that greatly minimized government intervention into the market process. They had low and predictable taxes, and it basically went from a backwater into, an economic center of the world. So I guess that's my general point, is that I agree with you on the technological aspect, but there's this cultural aspect of who's going to embrace the technology, who's going to be aware that there's even a need for it. I don't know what's going on inside of mainland China, but the fact that you can publicly shame someone for saying something against the government strikes me as fucking absurd. That would never fly in the South. Like, I'm sitting in Tennessee right now. If you tried to publicly shame someone on a billboard for speaking out against the state, it just would not fly. I mean, speaking out against the state's expected here. So I'll leave it at that.
Cool, guys. So let's take some questions. I've been getting requests to speak all this call. Now's the time, people. Request to speak if you would like to ask questions for Robert and Yago. Go ahead. And in the meantime, guys, do you have any just overall go-to tips for the audience who might want to increase their sovereignty in this digital age, in this age of increasing governmental outreach?
Move to the South.
I think it's important to not think of the problem as an individual. So we talk about the sovereign individual, but I think that the way we as sovereign individuals make sure that we are able to maintain our liberty, maintain our sovereignty, is by not making the classic libertarian mistake. The reason libertarians always have failed in the past is because they're so focused on being individuals that they don't organize. And so we need to do what sovereign states do, which is form alliances. And so when people talk about the Bitcoin community or the sovereign community, that I think is something we need to stress more. We need to stress a shared culture, a set of shared educational tools, co-locate ourselves, and work together, because I do think that the dangers are real, and that any given individual ultimately the best they can do is hide. Whereas if you want to be able to live truly free, you can't be hiding. And so we need to create those pockets of the world where a culture of freedom is able to flourish.
Yeah, I agree with that completely. It's maybe excessively romanticized, the idea of just being the pure libertarian, sovereign individual, don't tread on me, self-sufficient lifestyle. But it's also not possible, let's say not practical at least. If you're going to enjoy the wealth that the division of labor offers you, then you have to be integrated into some society, some economic network. And I guess my hope is that by empowering people through radically effective defensive technologies for capital, just Bitcoin and the surrounding things that are being built on it, you give people the freedom to determine which set of values best suits them at the individual level, and then communities can coalesce around these principles or values. So my general hope is, the drum that I try to beat a lot is just freedom. Like, just if we could just hold that as our highest value and let the rest sort itself out. And freedom, it manifests itself in life, liberty, property. We've known about these principles at the basis of Western civilization now for at least 800 years. This is not news. We may have forgotten it, but we've known about it for a long time. So in a way, I kind of look at the Bitcoin movement as a return to our roots, a return to the historical foundations of what got us to this point in history in the first place. Like, the reason we're so wealthy, the reason we have the digital age, the reason we have fucking Bitcoin is because we built an economic experiment called Western civilization on the principles of life, liberty, and property. We have since deviated, but hopefully now the new prevailing technological realities of the 21st century will offer us a gateway to return to that.
Andres, you've been waiting for a minute here. Go ahead and ask your question.
No worries. I'm just walking here around and you guys offer questions. So here I go. How do we deal with Bitcoin in the next pandemic? Like, if there's only Bitcoin and no US dollars or a lightning rail or something, that means like whoever gets most cases of COVID is going to have to spend more Bitcoin. Like, if you take that, and then, the other thing is I was sleeping on the idea of communities like churches. They start accepting Bitcoin. So the church that has the best community will put more to the church, Bitcoin, and making the community more wealthy, in that regards. Whoever, at the end of the story, we're religious, right? So, that was in my mind. Yeah.
Robert, you want to go first, or should I?
I didn't hear any of that question, so I don't know if someone can.
I think Andres he had two questions, but I'll repeat the first. His question was, in a society which is run along the lines of what we've been discussing, a free society where Bitcoin is the currency and there can be no fiat inflation, what happens when a massive unexpected disaster like a pandemic hits? Who's going to foot the bill?
The answer is individuals. in a world where fiat currency is not the primary monetary medium, and you have a hard money like Bitcoin, you are incentivized to save, and you accumulate savings as a buffer against the uncertainty of the future. But I would further add here that there was no pandemic economic disaster. There was a state-imposed lockdown that was an economic disaster. That state imposition would be much smaller, if not non-existent, in a Bitcoinized world, because you just couldn't enforce that level of compliance across the world. You wouldn't have the central government to do it in the first place. So that's question's been asked a lot, and I think it betrays a deep notion of irresponsibility. This idea that we should be able to coerce those with money, or those with savings, or those with economic, those with command over capital, to then support those that were not adequately prepared. I just don't buy that argument ever. I think that everyone is ultimately responsible for themselves, and the more we remove taxation, inflation, regulation, confiscation of all sorts, in other words, the stronger we make the relationship of property between people and their stuff, the faster, better, and more efficiently the market resolves calamities of all sorts, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's a supply chain disruption, whether it's a meteor strike. Humans self-organize better in a world of strong property. So the question even belies kind of this not thinking deeply enough about what actually created the economic calamity itself, in my opinion.
I think that was very well said, Robert, and I'll just add that Bitcoiners were not just early to Bitcoin, they were also early to the pandemic. I think it was long before the rest of the world caught on. I and other Bitcoiners I know had already started gearing up. Bitcoiners tend to be more prepared. And they have a culture of curiosity, of adversarial thinking, of looking forward. They have a culture, ultimately, of rational self-reliance and self-responsibility. And coming back to the topic of culture, that is the culture that I most closely associate with Bitcoin, and I think is most closely associated with self-sovereignty.
Yeah, agreed. And I would add here, just to tie it back to the sovereign individual, it predicted a number of things, but the pandemic itself, the use of a pandemic as an excuse to reinforce the validity of state borders, was also predicted in that book. So COVID was no real surprise in that sense.
All right. Well, Robert, while we wait, what are some of the next pieces of content you're going to be putting out?
I'm going to be wrapping up the Sovereignism series. And then I don't know, actually. I've got a lot of things in the queue. I don't know which direction I'm going to go next. I originally thought that I would kind of veer towards Bitcoin and energy, but there's been so much content put out about that recently. I think I'm going to go another direction. Yeah, I wish I had a better answer for you, but just embracing the freedom right now, and I'm not sure.
Fair enough. For me, it's midnight, so how about we take two more questions, one or two more questions, and then I at least am going to call it a night.
Absolutely. David Sroy, you have the floor. Go ahead.
Hey, guys. Thanks for doing this. So I'm curious, is sovereignty a spectrum? And if we get into this future state where Bitcoin is the standard, but the nation state in some form still exists, would you consider that as being sovereign, or is it kind of like an all or nothing thing? It's like, nope, either the nation state exists and we're not sovereign, or, it's kind of like the libertarian utopia. Is there any in between?
Definitely sovereignty exists on a spectrum. Even today, if you could look at your effective tax rate as kind of a proxy. And it doesn't tell the whole story, but, the example I like to give is if your effective tax rate is 100% and all the fruits of your labor go to a taxing authority, then you are effectively 0% sovereign. you are a slave. That's the definition of a slave, actually. Someone whose work product goes entirely to someone else, not to themselves. They have no property rights at all. They're a slave. On the other end of the spectrum would be a 0% sovereignist, right, where they keep 100% of all the fruits of their labor. They can trade those fruits with other self-owned people or semi-self-owned people. So that's a gradient there. Now, it doesn't tell the whole story because it doesn't talk about your net worth. You know, what is your capital position? Obviously, that gives you a lot of optionality that someone even with a 0% tax rate but a $0 net worth doesn't necessarily have. But you know, like everything else in reality, it's continuous. I don't think it's binary. It's not all or nothing. The second part of the question was the future. I think it's the same. I would encourage you to check out my series with Balaji. He has a thesis that we see a decentralized West and a centralized East emerging. So that would clearly be a spectrum of individual sovereignty manifesting itself in the geopolitical hierarchy worldwide. Seems plausible to me. I don't think nothing ever happens, well, I'll say nothing. Few things happen all at once, all or nothing. And I don't think sovereignty falls into that category.
Okay, thank you, Robert. THST bot, go ahead. You can unmute yourself. THST bot.
Yeah, kind of a short question, might be a long answer. I was kind of curious on Robert's conception of what the state is. A lot of times I feel like it's dissolved, it's broken down to just monopoly on violence. I didn't know if you had a bigger conception of it than that.
I think Mises said it best, that it's the social apparatus of coercion, compulsion, and violence. Its primary feature is that it creates a peaceful economic enclave within which citizens have property rights, presumably, to trade amongst themselves and create wealth, create the division of labor. And then citizens also have access to a rule of law, which is effectively a nonviolent dispute resolution mechanism for individual actors competing over scarce resources, right? Wherever the market cannot resolve a dispute, recourse to the rule of law hopefully will, so that we don't have to have violent conflict. And you know, in that definition, there's always going to be a role for a state, in that we always need some physical security provider and meat space to preserve the integrity of people's relationships to their stuff, right? Relationships to the fruits of their labor, and the rule of law itself, which grounds out in that property relationship. So there's always going to be a need for it, but I think the big problem in the world today is that there's been no check on it. You know, gold was somewhat of a check historically, but that was corrupted, let's just say, in a nutshell. And we've gone away from that as a check on government today. And now we have, fortunately, we have digital gold emerging as a veto option on the state. Should the state be excessively oppressive or prey on property rights too heavily, people can now effectively cast a vote of no confidence in the state by moving into Bitcoin and moving elsewhere, moving to where they're treated best.
Okay, thank you very much, Robert. We're going to wrap this one up. Thank you to our guests, Edan Yago and Robert Breedlove. Feel free to follow them on Twitter if you liked what you heard. Also, of course, ourselves at Sovryn BTC, if you'd like to follow us. And also, if you say hablas español, our new Sovryn Spanish Twitter, Sovryn ES. That would be great. Thank you again, guys, for joining us. And remember, stay sovereign. Thank you, fellas.
Thank you.